Hello and welcome to everyone joining us for today's discussion about the challenges and opportunities for the cybersecurity community as the world grapples with COVID-19. I think the lessons in dealing with this pandemic make clear why the Aspen Institute has prioritized cybersecurity. My name is John Carlin, and I serve as the chair of Aspen's cybersecurity program. One of the issues we've been tackling for the last couple of years is trying to get the private and public sector to concentrate together on a threat that can cause massive disruption to our way of life, but has not yet occurred on the scale that every expert in this space knows it can. And in that sense, unfortunately, it's similar to the pandemic that our families, our jobs, and in our personal lives we're confronting today. And we've seen great courage from first line and frontline responders, great creativity from companies as they try to go about providing basic goods and services and healthcare to our communities in the midst of a pandemic unprecedented in our modern times. One of the areas that's been laid bare by confronting this pandemic that each of you listening today, and I know I have in my life, have encountered is trying to get our jobs done, trying to get our schooling, trying to get basic supplies, and all relying on working remotely, on having things, essential information, working through digital supply chains. And as we've creatively and on a scale that's simply unimaginable, I mean, think about our conference today. We're using Zoom. Zoom, according to their CEO, has gone from approximately 5 to 10 million users to 200 million users in a matter of weeks. And that's just one example of the creativity that different companies are using to scale to meet this threat. And in doing so, they're having to prioritize efficiency over security at times and try to work through creatively, hey, how can we deliver the same type of goods, services, communications using a digital platform securely? Unfortunately, the creativity and opportunism of our companies and governments to try to get us through this period is matched by the changing tactics and strategies of a determined set of adversaries that range from rogue nation states to online criminal groups to mischief makers, and even to those who want to inspire terror or political change by disrupting digital supply chains. One of the key initiatives at Aspen has been Aspen Cybersecurity Group, which brings together executives in the private sector, federal officials, and security research to try to solve some of the toughest problems confronting cybersecurity threat, even in regular times. And as part of that work, one of the areas they've focused on is operational collaboration, which is the challenge of moving beyond sharing information about threats or what's occurring on digital systems to sharing that information in a way that allows for real-time action to disrupt the threat. Today, we're going to discuss that issue, but not in a hypothetical. We're going to discuss the very real-world challenges and hear the latest on current threats from our top intelligence official at the FBI, and then hear from a member of the private sector who has come up with a creative way to get private companies to work together and work with government to confront the new threat actors. Before I introduce my guests more fully, I wanted to give a few housekeeping notes. After the initial remarks from each of our guests and a moderated discussion, so about 30 minutes in, we're going to take your questions. And you can submit the question using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom interface. If you're like my family over the holidays and my 80-some-year-old parents, everybody is learning to use Zoom or some version of it these days to do these conferences. And you can do that at any time during this broadcast. So if something strikes you during the first half of the session, feel free to submit it whenever you like, and then we're going to turn to it in the second half of, or attempt to turn to it in the second half of the discussion. If you're comfortable, please include your name and affiliation, just like you would do when you were attending one of our Aspen events in the real world. We are recording this webinar. We know that connections experiences can differ. So if you drop at any time or experience any other technical difficulty, don't worry, we will be posting the recording online for later viewing. And with that, let me introduce our two guests today. We are lucky to have Tanya Ugoretz, who currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Director of the Cyber Division of the FBI. And in that role, she's the lead analyst when it comes to cyber threats that the law enforcement community is facing. I've had the pleasure of knowing Tanya for a long time. I first met her when I was Chief of Staff at the FBI to Director Mueller, and she was the morning briefer. I believe the first person to fill that function full-time as an analyst, and watched her nimbleness as she experienced multiple deep cross-examining questions, often at that time around terrorist and other threats. Tanya went on from there to serve as the first director of the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, or CTEC, which is the first time that the intelligence community started a program similar to the analysis, but different in some ways, as the National Counterterrorism Center. That was hosted in the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and that's before she moved to her current role. And after we hear from some opening remarks from Tanya, we will turn to Mark Rogers. Mark Rogers is the Executive Director of Cybersecurity at Okta, a chief organizer for Defcon, one of the largest conferences in this space, and a white hat hacker. He also served as head of security for Cloudflare and helped run cybersecurity at the telecom giant Vodafone. One claim to fame that I cannot say includes designing the hacks that were used in the show Mr. Robot. So with that, let me give a rough order of show. We're going to hear from Tanya, then we're going to do a moderated discussion with Mark, then a moderated discussion with Mark and Tanya, and open it up to your questions. So with that, let me turn it over to Tanya.
The kind intro. Thank you to Aspen for inviting me to participate today. And also thank you to everyone who's joining us today. What I'd like to do to start off is just to give kind of a brief scene setter of what we're seeing currently from the FBI's cyber perspective. So when we look at this, I think we're seeing really the collision between highly motivated cyber threat actors and an increase in opportunities that they can take advantage of. So let me go into more depth about what I mean about that collision. When we're talking about threat actors, we're talking about cyber criminals, those who are looking to conduct cyber intrusions, theft of information, a variety of cyber crimes, usually for personal profit. But then we also have nation states, which have a variety of other motivations, including theft of information and a desire to gain insight into how other countries, how medical institutions are responding to the COVID threat, so that they can have that information to inform their own response. And when I talk about the growth and opportunities that both those sets of threat actors can take advantage of, it really ties to what John was just describing, what we've all experienced in the past month or so, the rapid and really unplanned shift to moving our entire lives online, which you can imagine just creates a host of opportunities for professional cyber criminals and highly sophisticated countries that want to take advantage of that. So for example, the rapid shift to telework, many industries, most of them shifting to at least having some, if not all, of their personnel working from home, working online, using unfamiliar communication platforms, and in that haste to set everything up, perhaps not spending a lot of time on the front end in thinking about how to configure security settings, how to address the issue of having a lot of users using these platforms suddenly who aren't familiar with some of the basic cyber hygiene practices. We have that same shift in online education. Probably many of you in the audience are experiencing having your children's education, or maybe even your own, suddenly moving online and having to make that same adaptation to using unfamiliar technology and platforms where maybe security isn't foremost in your mind. At the same time, we have the companies whose job it is to focus on cybersecurity, and many industries who may be reducing their staffing when it comes to IT and other security. Some of those personnel may be working from home. When I think of a typical security operations center for IT or cybersecurity, that's often kind of a windowless room with lots of screens where people are sitting close together. That's not an environment that we can really have right now. So individual companies, as well as kind of professional cybersecurity organizations, have had to think about what does that look like to have that type of capability remotely. We also have an enormously high public interest in information, wanting to know what's the latest about COVID-19 or my stimulus check, or what my community's restrictions are on my going outside. That huge thirst for information probably causes us as human beings to lower our guard when we see information come across our screen with a flashy headline or a link that's inviting to us, promising that type of information. So probably, I'm no psychologist, but we probably have a little bit of a lowered security barrier coupled with that high interest in information that might cause us to click something we ordinarily might not. So all of that, all of those factors really add up to this environment where we have increased vulnerabilities online, and then an increased interest in threat actors to exploit those. So that's the theoretical. Let me tell you a little bit more about what we're actually seeing at the FBI and in the US government. So for cyber criminals, there was this brief shining moment when we hoped that, you know, gosh, cyber criminals are human beings too, and maybe they would think that targeting or taking advantage of this pandemic for personal profit, that might be beyond the pale. Sadly, that has not been the case. The FBI has an Internet Crime Complaint Center, the IC3, which is our main ingest point when members of the public or companies want to report having been the victim of internet-related crime or fraud. And sadly, the IC3 has been incredibly busy over the past few months. Whereas they might typically receive 1,000 complaints a day through their internet portal, they're now receiving something like 3,000 to 4,000 complaints a day. Not all of those are COVID related, but a good number of those are.
Tanya, how would a citizen make a complaint to the Internet Crime Complaint Center or IC3? How would someone watching know where to go?
Yeah, it's quite easy. Just navigate to ic3.gov and you'll immediately be taken to a site where you're able to see recent information in the press room of advisories about cyber threats. There's a button to submit your own complaint. And I can tell you for sure that there are human beings on the other end of that portal who not only are receiving your complaints, but they're very quickly routing those to the appropriate FBI field office, or in the instances where you're reporting that you may have been the victim of internet fraud, where you think you've actually kind of had money leave your account and go to someone fraudulently, they have a recovery asset team where they are actually able to work with financial institutions to try to recover those funds. So that's a new team that was just started in 2018. In its first full year of operation in 2019, it was able to recover $300 million for mostly individuals who submitted complaints of internet fraud.
That's a really important point, and just to throw in, I know I've personally worked with victims who've been able to recover in individual instances of fraud, millions of dollars they thought was lost because they contacted that center. So just in the public service announcement for those watching, if you see the fraud, it makes a huge difference to your team, right, Tanya, if it's done quickly. So in the first 3 days or 72 hours, I think they have a nearly 100% success rate of being able to reverse the transaction. In one instance, though, I know that was a multi-million-dollar case. They were successful, and it had been over a week and a half since the transaction took place. So it's not hopeless, but if you're able to do it early, much higher rate of success.
Yeah, that's right. Speed is really key. And I'm glad to say the people who do that work have a pretty high job satisfaction rate, because I think sometimes people have the misperception that the FBI is only working kind of the biggest, most highest dollar amount losses and crimes. But I mean, we have instances where, not exaggerating, a widower lost all of her money that she thought she was wiring to purchase a home, and we were able to get that back for her. So the people there really enjoy what they do. So just coming back to the COVID frauds that we're seeing, they really run the gamut. Everything from setting up fraudulent internet domains so that you might think you're going to a website for a legitimate seller of personal protective equipment or a government organization, and yet someone has created an internet address that spoofs the actual address. Maybe it's one character off, maybe it's slightly different, and they instead send you to a site where they're able to either steal your information or elicit more information from you in furtherance of fraud. We've seen people set up fraudulent COVID charities, promise delivery of masks and other equipment and then not deliver, fraudulent loans, extortion, etc. So pretty much, sadly, anything you can think of, the cyber criminals are quite creative. And then on the nation state side, as you can imagine, countries have a very high desire for information, as I mentioned, about how other countries are responding, but also about things like research on vaccines, what's happening in the US healthcare sector and our research institutes. So we have certainly seen reconnaissance activity and some intrusions into some of those institutions that have, especially those that have publicly identified themselves as working on COVID-related research. There's certainly good reasons for those institutions to tout the work that they're doing and educate the public on the work that they're doing. The sad flip side is that it kind of makes them a mark for other nation states that are interested in gleaning details about what exactly they're doing, and maybe even stealing proprietary information that those institutions have. That's really nothing new. It's certainly heightened during this crisis, but for example, we know the biotechnology industry has been a priority target for cyber espionage for a number of years. So just briefly then, in terms of where we see this going next, sadly, there's a precedent for cyber criminals to take advantage of also natural disasters and government economic relief packages. So looking ahead to the massive effort to provide stimulus checks and other funding to US companies and to individuals. That unfortunately is also going to be a target of fraudulent activity. So we expect that to be no different, and I would point you to an op-ed that the FBI and the US Secret Service co-authored, that it was in the Washington Post a day or two ago, that just kind of highlighted the scope and scale we fear we might be trying to prevent when it comes to that type of fraud. And we've already seen a little bit of an increase in phishing emails, in emails coming from people purporting to be from the Treasury Department, saying, click here to receive money about your stimulus check. And obviously that's a very tempting link to click. So why don't I just stop there, John, and I'll turn it back to you.
That's great. Thank you, Tanya. And you've given a laundry list of scary things that are occurring by bad guys, and some of what the government is doing to respond to it. But I want to turn now to Mark. And Mark, you've started this Cyber Threat Intelligence League with some other co-founders. Tell us a little bit, what are you doing in the private sector, and what do you think can be done to confront these threats and new actors taking advantage, and old actors, new and old actors taking advantage of our new threat landscape?
So, well, thank you for having me, and I'm very pleased to address this audience. And thank you, Tanya, because the work the FBI has been doing is absolutely phenomenal. As cybersecurity experts, we love what we do. And so it might seem strange to people that when we come home from work, we would want to do more of the things that we do in our day job. But, well, if we can't go out and have a beer, then the next best thing is opening our laptop and doing stuff. And there's also a really, really pronounced appetite for good in the community. And so a group of us came together and thought, let's do something about this. Let's see if we can pull a few of our friends who are sitting on their sofas at home playing games and maybe turn it into something positive and channel that energy towards fighting this wave of crime. And what Tanya said is absolutely correct. This is an unprecedented situation. It's not altogether unexpected. We've seen spikes in cybercrime when things like Olympic Games happen or national disasters, because criminals are aware whenever anything happens that causes uncertainty or disruption or leaves vacuum of information, they can use that as a lure to draw you in and make you click on whatever it is that they're pushing. So we were anticipating something. What we weren't anticipating was World War Cyber, which is pretty much what we're facing. I'm seeing phishing emails from every language known to man. In fact, the flood of the messages is so fast that as fast as we put up technology, it gets swamped to do it. So we created the League. If you bring up the first slide, this is us. This is the CTI League. We are a collaborative group built out of cybersecurity experts, which makes up the majority of our membership. But we also include law enforcement, we include government officials, and we include pretty much every discipline across information security. We now have expanded to about, I think, 76 countries and are roughly 1,400 members. We cover every single time zone other than 2. The growth has been phenomenal. If you move on to the next slide, you can see just how fast we've grown literally in 3 weeks. People are throwing themselves at us to help because there's this massive appetite. If you move on to the next slide, this is the distribution, right? As you can see, every single continent is represented, and quite a significant number of countries are represented. Obviously, there are some countries that have yet to come to the game and we would welcome, and there are some countries that we have to be cautious about engaging with, because working with law enforcement, we don't want to work with anyone who has active embargoes against them, etc., because there's a delicate balance. But we believe that we can support.
Let me jump in there just for a second, Mark, just to highlight what you're saying and ask a question around it. So what you're saying is you've had this league, and for those following it at home, today is going to be the first time. So this is news that Mark's putting out for the first time. He's going to talk about some of what this unprecedented league that cuts across countries has discovered about criminal actors and nation state actors and what they're doing about it. But what you're saying in terms of the, because this has been one of the questions that's troubled the community, is we want a global coalition, and yet some of the actors are the bad actors that our companies are fighting about. In fact, just yesterday, the FBI, working with partners across the intelligence community and the State Department, put out a notice about North Korea, for example, talking about their cyber activities, and we'll talk about that a little bit with Tanya later. So what you're saying is, what measure did you use to say, hey, there are some countries that even if they wanted to, we wouldn't work with here? You're using the sanction regime? Is that what I was hearing?
Yes, essentially. What used to be called the OFAC list, which is now a list of countries that the US has active embargoes against. We had a very heated discussion about this because we see this as a humanitarian project. Excuse me. But in order for us to have the deep collaboration we have with government and law enforcement, we have to be able to be careful about how we walk that line. Trust and the ability to share information is critical to the success of this project. What we concluded at the end of it was, if we just go after the bad guys, irrespective of where they are, then we're going to help those other countries that we can't necessarily invite to be active participants within the league. And so by doing that, I think we can protect the whole world, while also maintaining that fine line we have to ensure that everybody is comfortable with what we're doing. So that's
Let's talk a little bit then, yeah, and move to what is it that you're finding and what have you been able to do?
Yeah,
go to the next slide.
Yeah, if we move to the next slide. So just talking about the malicious domains that Tanya mentioned before, we have a number of different active feeds. We're pulling in information about new registries that look suspicious. For example, if it's got COVID in it, we'll take a look at it and see if it's malicious. We're also pulling out domains from things like phishing emails, from malware that we reverse engineer, and then those domains get fed through several processes. One of those processes is the takedown process. And that's a process that we do in collaboration with the registrars, with the trust and safety groups across industry, and with government and with law enforcement. One of the things that people often ask is, you're fighting back, does that mean you're hacking back? No, we're not. We're using the same tools that we use in our day job, the same skills that we've developed over years make us particularly good at actually dealing with some of these problems. And so in the 3 weeks that we've been operating, we've taken down 2,833 malicious domains. And as you can see from the list of sort of high profile impersonators, some of the domains that we've taken down have been ones that are impersonating government or financial institutions from countries all over the world. And I fear this is actually just the tip of the iceberg, because some of our members will take lists off and do their own work, and many are also feeding information to their companies to enable them to do it. So this is just what we see on our platform. There's a much greater spread of action that's going on. If we move to the next slide, one of the other things we're doing is we realized quite quickly that after the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks, hospitals are deeply vulnerable to being attacked by advanced malware. And if something like that gets inside a hospital, there's no way we can provide really robust assistance without incredible support. And I suspect it's something only that the government would be best placed to actually provide support. And in many cases, even that's going to be hard. Something like 70% of all the medical facilities in the US are small, small operations which don't necessarily even have their own CISO. So how do you engage with an operation like that? So our idea was, let's find these vulnerabilities. Let's do it in a light way. We don't want to actively scan these institutions because we don't want to risk triggering a problem with their infrastructure. But there are open source intelligence tools, things like Shodan, that we can use to find infrastructure that has been exposed. And this gives you an idea.
Mark, to make sure we're following along. So you're using open source tools and decided as a group, hey, one of the sectors we're most worried about, and this is consistent with what we heard from Tanya in terms of where criminals are aiming their resources right now, is the medical sector, plus the consequences of a disruption right now in the medical sector are so severe that you decided to put out to your group a call to essentially spend time and resources looking at open source information about medical institutions to find vulnerabilities that they may not have spotted. And then what do you do when you find them? How do you alert?
So it really depends on the type of vulnerability we find and the severity of it. In a simplistic way, the low severity vulnerabilities we find that everything has to be above a threshold enough where we are concerned about it, i.e. it's something that could be actively exploited. If it's sort of a relatively low severity, we then work through organizations like the Healthcare ISAC, who are part of our collaboration, or we work directly with the institutions themselves. We have CISOs from those institutions. We have representatives from other industry bodies on there, and we have representatives from suppliers who work with those institutions. And we use those as a channel to communicate with the institution to say, hey, you've got this piece of infrastructure that's exposed, it's got this vulnerability, these are the steps you need to take to protect it, even if it's just a case of taking it offline. The more serious vulnerabilities, we kick up to our partners in the FBI, or we kick them up to our other great partner, DHS CISA, who have been phenomenal as well in taking these vulnerabilities forward, finding the right contacts, and helping us triage them. There's one anecdote I'd like to give. Unfortunately, I can't name the institution because I don't think it's right to name institutions that have had major issues. But in this case, the institution had an infrastructure vulnerability that was actively being exploited by a malware campaign. And by working with CISA and with other members of with other agencies in the US government, plus by having our people working on the malware end and the campaign, we were able to dismantle the campaign and arrange for the infrastructure vulnerability to be patched in 3 hours. Now, many enterprises that are well put together would be proud of a turnaround time like that.
No, that's fantastic. And let me pivot there with a question to Tanya that we received from the audience. So Tanya, Eric Geller at Politico asked, how is the US helping healthcare organizations defend themselves from nation states? So Mark has talked here in terms of the CTI, how they're identifying vulnerabilities, sometimes providing it directly to the organization, but in more serious cases that they're going to the FBI or to CISA for assistance. And Eric asks, he knows that the FBI generally investigates and that Homeland helps harden or defend, but how might the FBI help an organization other than providing forensic evidence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think our name notwithstanding, the FBI, particularly in cyber, is doing a lot more than investigating. There's really kind of 3 pillars to what we do, which is operations, intelligence, and engagement. and those all feed together. In this particular case, the information that we're receiving about the types of threat activity that we're seeing, it's really not put to best use if we are just collecting that for someday in the distant future in the hopes of arresting and prosecuting an individual. Our mission is to impose risk and consequences on those cyber adversaries and use what we learn to help support network defenders as well as the other agencies that have that mission, like CISA. So in this particular case with the healthcare sector, when this pandemic started, we immediately did a scrub for everything that we could push out at the lowest possible, well, really the broadest possible level to the public and to the private sector. We probably had the biggest push of unclassified alerts, what we call private industry notifications, flashes, as well as public service announcements to share everything we knew that we could share with the public and with industry about steps that they could take to defend themselves based on exactly the activity we were seeing. So that's the broad part. But we have a team that's called Mission Critical Engagement, and they are the ones who do the do the really targeted outreach. So for example, if we see that a particular institution is being targeted or is a victim, we'll of course go out and work with them. But ideally what we're doing is talking to, in this case, healthcare institutions or research institutes before they're the victim of this activity. So we can use the intelligence we have to identify those trends and ideally identify who else might be in the same category, who could be a victim of similar activity. And through our field offices, which are scattered throughout the country, we're able to go out. And right now during the pandemic, we're going out virtually. Ideally, we like to make that contact in person, but we're sharing with them what we have, and we're alerting them that we really recommend that they raise their defenses and be aware that they might be a target, because especially for our healthcare institutions right now, that's probably not going to be top of mind.
Yeah, and understandably not top of line. Mark, with everything else that the healthcare sector has going on right now, and I'll add one thing to your list, Tanya, that I know we've worked with victims in my current hat when working with the FBI, and sometimes a group like Mark can give general information about the threat, what they're seeing on open source, how they've affected other actors, but the Bureau might have unique insights because you're collecting on the other end of the threat, or serve as the point of contact, even if it's another agency collecting on the other end of the threat. And when it's a particular victim, I've seen a real change at the FBI in terms of trying to lean forward, and even though it might jeopardize certain sources and methods, share that information if an organization's under ongoing attack so they can protect themselves. And to do that, just encourage folks listening, if you're in that situation, you need to go directly into the FBI or the Secret Service and have that conversation. And sometimes the answer is they don't know that much more, but sometimes they might really know a lot about the particular threat actor you're dealing with. Mark, I wanted to move a little bit to your experience in pre-COVID activities, Defcon, and your long background in the white hat hacker community, and give a little sense of how is that experience applicable to what you're doing with CTI. When I look at your growth rate over 3 weeks, it's remarkable, and the thousands of sites you've been able to take down. But I wonder, is that something that you could apply that could last longer than COVID-19, that could be a model for the future?
Well, so there's quite a lot to unpack there. So first of all, the work that I've done at Defcon has been instrumental in helping with setting this up. It's through Defcon that I had good relationships with many of these agencies and with law enforcement. And so I was able to reach out through those past relationships to tap into it. It also gave me an understanding that if this was to be successful, we needed to have tight collaboration with law enforcement and government, because just as you pointed out, there are things that civilians can do, but there are lines that we can't cross, and there are things that we don't know. And so only by working in kind of coordination and collaboration can we truly address this problem across the board. And so Defcon taught me a lot about that. We triage an amazing number of issues at Defcon. I could probably do an entire show just on Defcon war stories. So it's taught me a lot. And from the white hat hacking perspective, I've learned a lot about giving vulnerabilities to institutions. It's hard. It's incredibly hard. I started disclosing vulnerabilities to institutions back in the 90s. And while it's evolved immensely since then, and we've had some fantastic step changes, largely due to some larger than life characters like the Loft and people like Katie Missouri, who've really shaped the industry's understanding of how bugs should be managed and the resources that are needed. It is still an incredibly difficult process. There's always a certain amount of nervousness about getting information about a vulnerability from somebody you don't have a relationship with. And there's always a certain kind of question of what's this person out to gain? And again, that's where our partner with law enforcement and with agencies and industry bodies like the Healthcare ISAC and the certs brings us the legitimacy, because if we can't engage directly, we can go through a channel that they recognize. That's also why we're dealing with some suppliers, because even if an organization may not be big enough to be a big member of the Healthcare ISAC or may not have a permanent CISO, they almost always have some sort of supplier relationship. And so if you can find a supplier who can pass it, they probably trust their supplier. And so if their supplier gives them a heads up, they're going to take it more seriously. So
let me push on that a little bit. And with Tanya, I noticed there was new guidance put out by the Department of Justice's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, or CCIPS, about what should the rules of the road be for the private sector when they are collecting particularly dark web intelligence. So, and it's been one of these gray areas that I think has been difficult for those in the private sector, where the forums where bad guys are sharing the information sometimes require a payment to gain entrance to the forum. Security researchers want to be on those forums because they hear all sorts of interesting things, just like law enforcement does. There are so many of them that governments alone can't cover them. So that's why the private sector is stepping into the gap, and it's something that generally it seems like the government has encouraged as long as the information has been shared. And just picking up on something that Mark said, I do think one of the more difficult areas is, how do you distinguish between someone blackmailing because they've discovered a vulnerability and they're threatening to disclose it unless you hire them for their services or pay them for the fee? Also, it can be difficult if they publicly disclose the vulnerability, to gain publicity for the organization, and they do it before warning the companies and before there's a fix for the vulnerability. It can be, like waving a red cape to a bull, and every bad guy rushes to exploit it before it's fixed. From the Bureau's perspective, how do you work with places like Mark and the CTI that are trying to do the right thing by finding them? What do you encourage them to do?
Yeah, we've established some, well, I would say we've worked with partners like CTI in the context of organizations like the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, or NCFTA. This is actually a nonprofit based in Pittsburgh that brings together academia, cybersecurity researchers, private sector, as well as law enforcement, and kind of creates a safe space where we all kind of sit side by side and have a regime whereby we can share information and ideally act more quickly on what each is seeing. And I really think that's the model for the future. There are understandable and legitimate and kind of righteous limits on what the government can do and what the government can see in cyberspace. There's a great amount of insight that private sector, cybersecurity researchers, et cetera, bring to this. And I really think that's the path for the future. We have to bring these worlds together to be able to share what we know and to be able to inform action in a more comprehensive and faster way against these threats.
And another question from the audience. This is from not sure how to pronounce the last name, but spelled Data, D-A-T-A, from the National Security Institute at George Mason University. And he asked, and I think Mark, maybe we'll start with you on this, but what kind of skills gap do you think there is? What should public sector organizations be looking for to improve their cybersecurity defenses? And I'll say, as I turn to you, at the Aspen cybersecurity program, we've put out a series of principles if folks are looking at on hiring, because one of the things we've noticed is that the skills that were put forth, the qualifications for positions, often required overqualification, and unintentionally, companies were losing out on diversity in their workforce, losing out on younger employees who could learn the skills if given the chance, but because the qualification required things like a BA that, for instance, the National Security Agency does not require, rather than looking for certain skills or aptitude, they were inadvertently cutting out the very employees that they wanted, which was leading to this growing gap that we're seeing in not being able to fill jobs with employees who have the cybersecurity expertise. And at a time of massive, just unprecedented growing unemployment, I would say to those listening there as well, the one area where I still see people trying to hire is around cybersecurity, and they're still seeing the skills gap. So Mark, turning to you, where do you see the skills gap, and what do you think that public sector organizations in particular should be doing to address it?
So there's two answers to that question. And the first and easy answer is across the board. We need people with all sorts of cybersecurity disciplines. An organization that doesn't have enough well-trained incident responders is going to struggle, even if they have like some of the best threat hunters in the world, because what do you do when something bad happens? Likewise, information security generalists, compliance specialists, they're all needed. The problem is actually in recruiting. I think the first issue is that companies fail to understand that security people evolve. And if you are not providing a good pathway and understanding that you bring people in almost like growing a plant, you bring them in at a seed stage where they have a set of cybersecurity skills and you task them, and then you let them grow into the tree that they want to be and find the disciplines that they want, you're not going to keep good cybersecurity people. As they evolve into other things, you're going to lose them, and that's going to cause your gaps. The other challenges are, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but there is still quite a significant challenge for women in most technology disciplines. That's something that we have to work on hard to make sure that the information security industry is seen as welcoming for everybody, no matter what race, color, creed, or sex. And finally, the other thing, and this has been a big one that I've been working on, I've done a few keynotes about this, is identifying people with the right kind of mindset and skill set early on. Some countries are really good at this, and they pull them out early on and set them on special training programs. The US and sadly my own home country, the UK, are not particularly good at this. And as a result, we're not training up a new workforce. And if you don't tackle the problem at the start, when people are learning, you can't expect the pipeline to be producing a large number of skilled people at the other end.
No, that's a great point. And I'm going to pivot from that to going back to one of the reasons why they're needed. Tanya, we got a question from Sangmin Lee from Radio Free Asia, but about the North Korean release that I talked about a little bit yesterday. So this is, for those that did not see it, this was a threat advisory put out by FBI, State Department, and others about North Korean cyber attack activity. Is that linked to COVID-19? Could you talk a little bit about why it's put out now and what our audience should take away from it?
Sure, thanks. So I think this is actually an example that maybe should make all of us feel good that the government can actually do more than one thing at a time. So I wouldn't necessarily read into the timing on this case. But as you mentioned, the intent of the advisory is really to raise awareness about the threat posed by North Korea's cyber activity. It highlights a litany of their malicious cyber activities around the world, identifies US government resources that are available that provide more technical and threat information, as well as some recommended measures to counter the threat. We regularly share cyber threat information with the public, with international partners, with the private sector. And I think the benefit of this advisory is that rather than having to look through what each individual government agency has to say, this is really a comprehensive resource going back the past few years on kind of, you know, the universe of cyber activity that we've seen North Korea doing.
Mark, let me pivot to you for a second on that. But with CTI, when we focused earlier, and this is the first time you've put out those remarkable statistics today in terms of the nearly 3,000 sites that you've taken down, the malware that you've been able to uncover and reverse engineer. How do you distinguish a lot of, if you read through the advisory from yesterday, and I'm seeing this in my J job at Morrison Forrester working with victim clients, is that they're getting hit by North Korean actors with what look like traditional criminal schemes. In some ways, North Korea is, you know, the world's largest thief, since they're a nation state acting like a criminal group to get currency. How do you distinguish with CTI? Do you view them as a criminal group? What do you attribute to North Korea, or do you just stop by seeing its criminal activity and focus on the malware and the vulnerability?
Actually, the stats that came up in the slides are just the tip of the iceberg. There's quite a bunch of other slides showing additional statistics, and we're going to put out a report on our website that shows the full scope of what we're doing. So we're working on things like malware analysis through to disinformation campaigns trying to cause civil unrest. What we do when we encounter things that we believe are being driven by nation states is we work closer with our law enforcement partners, because one of my initial thoughts on this was, if we can just help our law enforcement partners by clearing the field, removing the low-hanging fruit, and a significant amount of this opportunistic cyber attacks is basically reskinned old stuff that people are throwing because they see this as a gold rush. If we can help get rid of those, then that empowers the agencies to focus on the bigger threats, because the bad guys, the nation states, so I should say the really bad guys, the nation states, know that in this time of unprecedented disruption, when everybody is scattered and at home, we are more vulnerable than we've ever been. If you imagine what happens, say, when your laptop gets hacked because you click on a link in an email in an office, you've got some degree of, to coin a phrase, herd immunity. You can turn to the people in your office and look for protection. You can go to your IT department, you can go to your security department. But when you're at home, triaging that is really, really difficult. And these threat actors know it, and they know that with the disruption that's going on, they have an opportunity to act on that stuff. So it's
Well
again,
said, Mark. And you know, as you draw it out, I think back to when I was a line prosecutor doing computer hacking cases. I remember when Hurricane Katrina hit. It was one of the first times we moved towards this task force model in federal government, because we saw so many people opportunistically taking advantage of a tragedy and people's goodwill to set up fake charity sites. But what we didn't have then is, on the scale that you're describing, is so the volume has increased exponentially, and there was no group like yours to just knock them down before they hit anyone. And I think now that would create just an overwhelming influx for law enforcement and victims if there's not someone there actually taking action, not just passing threat, but knocking the sites, knocking the bad domains down as soon as they can pop up, and leaving only the more sophisticated actors to prey on folks. And with that, Tanya, I want to turn and ask a question to you. This comes from Carl H. at Communications Daily. They're noticing the FTC has been working with the FCC, so the Federal Trade Commission has been working with the Federal Communications Commission and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to combat COVID-related scams and fraud. And they want to know, is the FBI involved in that coalition? After Tanya's done, Mark, I was going to turn to you to see if you've had involvement with those same agencies with CTI, and if not, I bet you will after today. Tanya, what about the FBI?
Yeah, the FBI is certainly involved and working with the FTC and others on this threat. That's primarily through our criminal investigative division. They have close partnerships with those other agencies, may even have some personnel that are kind of on loan from one agency to the other to make sure that the information sharing is good as appropriate. But yes, we're definitely lashed up with them.
And is that an effort you were familiar with, Mark, or CTI?
so we're obviously not part of the government coalition working on this, but this is something that we are working on. We're familiar with what they're doing, and one of the principles of what we're doing is because it's driven by collaboration. We want to deconflict the work we're doing. So we don't want to duplicate efforts that the government's doing, and we don't necessarily want to step on toes, because there's no point in people going after the same things at the same time, or even worse, we don't want to get in the way of what the government's doing. I am actually involved in another group, which is working on building supply chains to help distribute medical supplies, etc. And so I'm providing them with cover in terms of cybersecurity threats, and they have been targeted. And other groups have come to us. This is probably actually one of the most heartwarming things about the response to this. There are so many different groups out there on the internet doing things like cyber threat intelligence. There's at least 3 major groups doing it. There's us, there's the COVID-19 Coalition, there's a group called C19 in the UK, but there's also groups like Open Source Medical Supplies on Facebook who are literally hand stitching face masks to go to hospitals. And so we're tracking all of those different groups and providing them with air cover to make sure that either people with bad intent don't end up in there trying to exploit what they're doing, or people who actually set out to disrupt them. We know
Mark, it's such a strong appeal that we're getting the question of, how do we join up? Is there a way that members who are listening can get involved with the CTI League? What's the process?
So for us, it's dead simple. If you go to our website, which is cti-league.com, there's a sign-up form. All members have to be vetted. We ask that only people with a cybersecurity background or a law enforcement background submit, because it's not a spectator sport. It's not that we don't appreciate your desire to help. We really do. It's just we need people with the right skills to hit the ground running, because you really do have to hit the ground running. But what I'll say to other people is, find the groups in your area. We've never seen this kind of level of collaboration across the board for all aspects of problems that are cropping up due to this pandemic. Join a group and help. I've got a good friend in Seattle who's making visors to distribute to hospitals by engaging all of the different makers distributed throughout Seattle to print the masks. Anyone with any kind of skill set can contribute in a way. You just need to find the right group for you.
And with that, I really want to thank both Tanya Ugertz and Mark for their contributions today, for the work that the FBI and CTI have been doing to confront this threat. The work that people are taking out of their time, as Mark suggests, to volunteer. And I think we're seeing an incident that brings out the worst in some of our adversaries and criminals and nation states, but really compellingly brings out the best in our fellow citizens, but also, as is demonstrated by this effort, across borders and across the world. So thank you again. Thanks for those of you that have listened. We're so grateful to have the participation of our guests. And with that, we'll wrap.